So my in-laws just called to let us know they're on their way over and we're out of food. Great. Luckily, Instacart helps me get groceries delivered in as fast as an hour. Plenty of time to cook an in-law worthy meal. Now, what to make? Chicken parm. Perfect. Download the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get $10 off your first order using the code PREPARED10. Now the only thing to worry about is dinner conversation. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $35. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.
Rap music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. If you listen to this show, I am pretty sure you will also like the China Econ Talk newsletter. Every week, I break down and analyze Chinese language media sources on the big news in tech and business. Check it out at chinaecontalk.substack.com. 5G. It's going to change your life. The next generation of mobile network technology will allow everything from phones to cars to God knows what people will dream up with to stream data 100 times faster than they currently can in 4G, practically ensuring that in a few years, folks will think 2019 was the equivalent to living in the dial-up age. Quote, 5G's integral role in these transformational technologies, Paul Triolo writes, means that to a much greater extent than with 4G, the development and deployment of the next generation network is being influenced by political concerns, even as information and communications technology companies, firms in affected sectors such as manufacturing and automobiles, and the entire national industries jockey for position in the emerging ecosystem.
Did I write that?
Yeah.
Wow, that's good.
Right? With the two biggest players in the space, the U.S. and China, locked in a trade war that seems to never end, we are excited to explore the dynamics and implications of 5G with Paul. Paul is the practice head for geotechnology at the Eurasia Group. He is also the owner of a new Huawei phone and has recently been able to upgrade it to 5G. So, Paul, has your life been changed?
Well, I hope so. I've only had the 5G capability for a few hours, but I'm already feeling pretty
frisky?
Pretty bold. Well, I was one of the few and early adopters of the Chinese internet subscription in 1995 with Beijing Telecom.
A little faster nowadays.
A 56K dial-up, and now I'm looking at streaming, one gig or more. But I have to find the right app to do it, and that's what I'm gonna be doing for the next couple of days is testing it. I understand from other people who've turned on their 5G in the last couple of weeks that the signal is there in a lot of cities in China, particularly in Guangdong and in Beijing.
Paul, how's your mobile first-person shooter level? Do you think you're ready to compete, or do you really need that 5G edge?
I think I really need the low latency, which we may not have yet, but that will come.
Okay, so you've been at this a long time, Paul. How has covering Chinese science and technology policy evolved in the decades you've been looking at it?
Great question. Well, it's gone from basically people considering China's ability to innovate or to develop technology a kind of a joke to now China is the 800-pound gorilla that's going to devour the U.S. on 5G. So I think it's interesting that we've sort of come full circle on this over the last 30 years. When I first came to China, I tried to make a phone call from Beijing, a landline phone call from Beijing to Xi'an, where I was teaching, and I could barely understand what the people were saying on the line because there was so much interference.
Yeah.
So now to have a 5G phone in my hand and have all the other accoutrements that involves is pretty amazing. What that implies in terms of infrastructure build out and sort of just tech development really rapidly in the space of 30 years.
What are the most surprising things? Were there turning points? What kind of learning should we take from the sort of progress that we've seen over the past?
Well, I think the interesting part of this whole process is that clearly the Chinese government saw the technology not as threatening necessarily, but as sort of enabling, both from a sort of economic point of view and from a governance point of view and a control point of view, right? So they could have decided, for example, on the internet to only do what Saudi does, which is to only let the sites they like be accessible, sort of a whitelist. But yeah. China chose that, they didn't choose that route. For example, on the internet, they chose to come up with a blacklist and to control integral part of it, but to not really throttle the technology development. They've kept ahead of it. The governance capacity piece of it, I think, that people miss, which is that they viewed technology early on as enabling them to do better governance, and that includes both the good and sort of, the things that people worry about in the West, like techno-authoritarianism, surveillance. But, really the thing is that they really embraced the technology and have spread it to every corner of China. I mean, you go to rural China and you can everybody's on their 5G phone. And now,
let's be 4G, maybe
4G,
right,
4G,
right.
Yeah. But now I was at a conference. Just one a good example of this is I was in a conference in Guangzhou, and I talked to the CEO of a new company that's now working with 5% of China's farmers on smart agriculture. So the AI-empowered drones are going out there and mapping the fields and optimizing, production. And the farmer doesn't have to; he can rent the drone, right? So I mean, that's an example of the sort of of how I think the government views technology as an enabler and as sort of a way to improve people's lives. At the same time as they are going to control aspects of it that they don't like.
So what do you think it is about the system that led it to take this perspective as opposed to a more restrictive one?
That's a good question. I think probably maybe the leadership, Chinese leadership, is sort of their engineers. A lot of them came out of an engineering background, and I think this idea of engineering, society in a sense is probably accounts for this desire to sort of use technology in ways to basically deal with a difficult problem, right? Which is a huge country, lots of different problems, and so I think they saw technology, maybe naively in some sense, that could solve some of the big problems that China faces, whether it's water issues and diverting the Yangtze River to the north, or whether it's trying to control the population because the lower levels of education mean that there's a lot of people don't obey the law or whatever. So I think they sort of saw technology as giving them a chance to sort of corral some of the aspects of the country that are a huge challenge, whether it's feeding people or making sure that they're not getting into trouble. Sure.
What do you think are the biggest blind spots still remaining in the CCP's tech policy?
I think that one of the big ones is that the role of the government in this. So I think if you look at China and sort of the success of the private sector and the technology sector, it's really been driven by companies that are operating in very competitive markets, like Haier, Huawei is a good example, DJI. I mean, these are companies that may have come out in part of the state sector and had some benefits early on in terms of subsidies, but for them to be
doing it, yeah.
But for them to be global players, that's not the government driving that. I mean, the government maybe has a supportive role as a customer of theirs, but they're really competing at the cutting edge. So doubling down on Made in China 2025 and other industrial policy, I think that's really going to be tough, because unless you just want to produce companies that are going to compete in China, if you want to produce global players, then letting the market forces work is a beautiful thing, and that's produced arguably China's most successful tech companies.
And then the downside, of course, being that if you only have folks focusing domestically, right, you don't get to the real cutting edge, which is what the goal of this is in the first place.
Exactly. And again, I think you come back to, there aren't that many really successful examples. So the sort of hardware guys, this is what China does well. The Huawei's, the Haiers have really sort of led the way. But the real challenge is going to be the Alibabas and the Tencent and the Baidus, those sort of over-the-top players, because those models are already inherently harder to take globally. And then if they're not able to compete domestically with foreign companies, then they're going to be less ready to compete globally. So we're in an interesting point now where Chinese companies that want to compete globally are going to really need to become more competitive, and that's not going to be something the government is going to be able to really drive, I think.
So in order to be able to compete competitively globally, you have to be able to be allowed to. Right. And I think the tenor around the world, certainly over the past 6 months, has really shifted pretty dramatically, not only on the bottom stack stuff, but also on the software side and the consumer facing side. So going abroad isn't just it's not just Yong'an, it's also being allowed to. And over the past year, we've seen real aggressive pushback on a lot of different fronts, not only in the Huawei's of the world, but also the ByteDances, Tencent's, Alibaba's. We've seen Blizzard, we've seen TikTok getting pressure all around the world, not to mention Huawei, of course. So to what extent do you feel like all this pushback in these Western capitals is justified?
That's a great question. Great question. So I think it probably depends on the companies. Some of them are longstanding, of course, concerns around things like mobile technology and Huawei becoming the poster boy there, and then the advent of 5G has driven that. I think that lately, things like ByteDance and TikTok, those are some of the problems I think that Facebook faced initially too, which is that these kinds of content platforms when they're in these different markets, they didn't realize how their platforms would be used. So Facebook never anticipated that they'd have to have people monitoring ethnic violence and the likelihood of that in rural Thailand, right? And so now I
love this quote from Disney's Iger saying, someone asked him so what do you think? They were talking in 2016 whether or not he should buy Twitter. He's like, what do you think about not doing that? He says, I thank my lucky stars every day. I do not have to deal with managing speech all around the world. Right.
And those are huge things. But of course, the added issue here with China is that the perception that all these Chinese companies are doing something at the behest of Beijing, or they're too close to the Chinese government, or that the Chinese government can order them to do something, right? So that's sort of the added burden that Chinese companies have when they're going abroad. Now, of course, interestingly, there are these examples like Haier. Nobody talks about Haier's refrigerators in the U.S. listening in on their student clients on campus, right? So there are Chinese companies that are in less sensitive areas.
Do you think it's because they're in less sensitive areas, or just because no one thinks about it?
I think it's probably both of those. But I was at a conference this week, and I talked to the chief technical officer of Haier, and it's amazing what they're doing. Right, they're putting smarts into all of their things, and so it is interesting and they're all over. Globally, they're a big player. They're a big player in the U.S. and nobody.
They got cultural cachet. Haier brothers, come on.
Right, exactly. So maybe nobody wants to take away the refrigerators where the students are warming up or cooling off their beer, on campus. But so I think that each of the companies that have generated this sort of blowback, they have different issues. They have a different level of PR. Whether they've been able to the narrative they were able to tell, and of course they're in different markets. Like obviously 5G has become this huge issue because of concern around who's building the infrastructure and all the data it's going to carry, and it's going to be it's going to be a huge mess. And so. Obviously, then Huawei and ZTE have become sort of poster boys for concern in the West, and particularly in the U.S.
Yeah, not to mention Xinjiang, which I think we saw this recent New York Times article over the past few days, and I would imagine that this will only sort of increase the focus on the what were those 4 AI firms, which aren't allowed to list in the US.
There were 8 AI firms that were put on the entity list in early October, and a very interesting case, right? I mean, because the entity list is traditionally been used for sort of clear national security concerns, companies that are shipping
the tips
nuclear
of the
products
missiles,
to small companies in Iran. So both in the case of ZTE and Huawei, they were the entity list was being used a little more broadly against really bigger companies and trying to manage bigger problems. Now here, in the case of Megvii, iFlyTech, Hikvision, these are the SenseTime, Yitu. These are sort of these second tier Chinese companies that are involved in AI. And in security and surveillance. And so the interesting part of this, is, okay, so people can understand that there's concern in the U.S. about Xinjiang and what's going on there. But the question is, what are the criteria for these companies to be put on the list, right? So if the company is selling, if 1% of its sales is to the Public Security Bureau in Xinjiang, is that enough to get them on the list? And what action can they take to get off the list is also interesting because, for example, Megvii has, in its IPO filing in Hong Kong, claims it has taken steps to reduce its exposure in Xinjiang. Yeah. So this raises the broader issue of how the U.S. is reacting to China's rise as a tech power. And if you're sitting in Beijing, you're seeing this list. We just did a list of Chinese companies that have been subject to some U.S. government action over the past year, and it's actually a surprisingly huge list.
Yeah, man, they got a big team over there.
Well, and it's not just the NA list. list, it's things like, rejecting the China Mobile 214 license to operate in the U.S., right? So it looks from Beijing's optic, it does look like, well, the U.S. really is concerned about, China's rise in all these areas and as a technology power. But obviously each one of these has its own driver, and and obviously things like the Xinjiang and the difficult situation there has driven this action against U.S. Chinese AI companies. The flip side of that, though, is that it's really put a big chill on the AI sector here in China. You just wrote a really good piece, I believe, on the China AI winter, which was excellent. So I think this is really, all these issues are tricky because of the if you concatenate them together, it looks like a sort of full up assault by the U.S. against Chinese tech companies.
Yeah. Oftentimes on Twitter, Paul, you seem to get frustrated by the lack of sort of technological background that people who comment on these sorts of issues we've been discussing about in this episode bring to the table. So take the next 5 minutes and, give the China Econ Talk listenership your syllabus to how to best bone up on these issues, which, a lot of folks listening to the show are, history majors and poli-sci majors and area study majors and have not put a lot of time into this, but at the same time understand that these are really important things for understanding the world in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I try not to be too annoying on Twitter, but I guess what I get frustrated with are comments related to technology that just show, it's not surprising, right? It's just people haven't been steeped in the industry. So our clients, for example, I spend a lot of time with clients that are on all sides of the tech issues, and they're either suppliers of hardware or they're customers, and so the industry view of the sort of the technology space and China's place in it, is one view, right? Yeah. And for example, a company like Huawei is viewed very differently in the industry than it is sort of in the DC bubble. Yeah. And so when I see people in the DC bubble, for example, talking about 5G and Huawei in a way that just does not comport with the view of the people who deal with them on a day-to-day basis, for example, in industry, and make claims, that are sort of memes that are repeated in the media often without being sort of, examined carefully, then I get a little frustrated. But
let's stay there for a second. So you spent a lot of time in government,
right?
What do you think are the sort of incentives that warp the sort of analysis of these issues within the Beltway? And do you feel like you've been able to learn a lot more, having lost your clearance?
Right. Well, absolutely. I think that within certain quarters of governments, the mandate is when you smell roses, you think funeral, right? You don't think wedding, right? And also there's it's difficult within government sometimes to get out and talk to industry, understand something as complicated as the mobile tech communications industry, right? It's a very complicated industry. I was in Barcelona with 135,000 people in March that were essentially the industry, right? And that's a very, very complicated group. There's lots going on in that space. And it's really impossible to understand that, I think, without, being at least tangentially related to the companies that are involved and talking to them on a regular basis and understanding what goes in, for example, to building a modern telecommunications network, right? It isn't rocket science, but it's pretty close.
And they're not in DC, right?
Right.
It's not like Raytheon is down the hall and, your former commanding officer works there and everyone's buds,
Right. And the other issue is it's global. It's a global industry. The global value chains and supply chains are everywhere, right? So the U.S. view of this, for example, is one view, but even U.S. carriers and U.S. players are global, right? They're not just U.S. companies. They're not just operating in the U.S. So the problem is in D.C., it's a very sort of U.S.-centric view of the world. And if you go to Europe or you go to Asia, you get a very different view of some of these issues. And again, I'm just trying to bring to the argument or to the debate a sort of industry view that's not, defending or, taking a position, a government position, or defending a company, but just saying, look, here's the reality of the industry. And if Carrier X has invested so much in infrastructure based on their willingness to trust a particular company, a particular vendor, then we have to at least account for that. If the U.S., for example, is going to adopt a policy that says, we don't like that vendor, you're going to have to rip that out. You're going to have to rip all equipment out, right? That comes with a cost. That comes with a lot of baggage. That I think that you don't get that argument when you're in the Beltway and in the bubble. It's just China. We can't trust China or Chinese companies, and so that's tough, right? And all I'm trying to say is that there's sort of another side to the story.
Sure. So given that there's another side to the story, like what do you think the Treasury Department should be doing?
The Treasury Department,
or I don't know, whatever.
Right. Well, if we take for example the issue of vendors and country of origin, which is a big issue, right? I think the approach that the UK and Germany have taken or will take is probably, at the end of the day, a more fruitful one and a more useful one. They've decided that they can, for example, mitigate the risk of any vendor in the network, no matter what the country of origin is, and working with the carriers, the government can increase standards around 5G security, for example.
Yep.
And UK made that decision back 10 years ago when they decided to allow Chinese companies into their market, because the carriers basically said we need to be able to have vendor diversity, and we need to be able to choose the best solution and the best cost for whatever we're doing. So the UK government agreed to that, and then they agreed to take extraordinary measures, for example, to review the source code of, in this case, of Huawei. So they
feel
took
bad for whoever they made. Whoever's on that job.
Right. That's can you imagine? But it's interesting that I don't think any other company that sort of turned over source code. Now the argument is, well, that it's all software, and so it doesn't really matter what the source code is. But in a sense, it's a major global multinational turning over source code to the intelligence services of a potential adversary. Right. So I think that approach is sort of balancing national security with economic sort of reality, right, of the cost of these things. I think that's an approach ultimately that would be more beneficial to everybody, right? It would ensure the 5G rollout is secure, and it would ensure that it happens in a reasonable time frame. Because I think otherwise, the U.S. sort of waited late. Europeans have told me this. They waited sort of late in the game to say, "Oh God, this is a problem." This was after vendors around the world or carriers around the world had invested billions of dollars in equipment.
Do you think that was a function of just like dysfunctional Trump White House 2016, 2017, or had the system not made up its mind as to how big a deal this was?
I think the system hadn't made up its mind, and sort of 5G was sort of still
very
on the horizon.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the big difference between, say, China and the U.S. is, China was obsessed with this mobile technology, 4G, and having Chinese companies participate. And so they made a big push with 5G. I wrote about this in my white paper, The Geopolitics of 5G. It was a whole of government thing. In the U.S., there hasn't been an industrial policy for a long time in a lot of areas. And so,
which may or may not be a bad thing. But
I mean, now recently there's been
a
big call
apparently.
for industrial policy, but basically the carriers were chugging along, and nobody really until last year sort of, I think in the U.S. government realized, wow, 5G is like just over the horizon, right? It's a year away, and sort of focused on the implications of what 5G really meant, and then you had pretty quickly, the policy come together that we see playing out right now.
Yeah. So you mentioned this new American push for industrial policy.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the dynamics that's really struck me in the past year or two, of America seeming to take policy cues from China in at least a few respects. Is this just what happens in every Cold War? I mean, what is the what are the dynamics here, and what potential risks of overreaction do you see?
Well, I think there are a couple of aspects. This one is because there's no U.S., for example, U.S. 5G vendor to compete with China. The question is, what should the U.S. 5G strategy be? And so that quickly leads you into some sort of policy of supporting alternative players or supporting the European vendors, for example. There's been a lot of talk of that. And then also a big part of that is, for example, U.S. spectrum policy. The U.S. has had no spectrum policy, and that's really huge. That's coming to a head, I think, in the next couple of months.
It's been decades. It's unbelievable.
Well, it's crazy because the mid-band spectrum, for example, for 5G is critical, and it's controlled in the U.S. by the satellite operators and the military. And there's nobody sort of sitting over those players at the White House that can say, hey, 5G should be a priority. Yep. So Congress now is weighing in on this. So that's one thing. The other piece of it is that there's a perception, it's been as part of the Trump agenda, that the U.S. lacks advanced manufacturing. So in the last couple of months, you've seen discussions around should the U.S. subsidize a big company to come to the U.S., return to the U.S., either a U.S. company or, for example, Taiwan's TSMC, which makes semiconductors. So part of the bigger picture is that because of the way supply chains have developed over the last decade, and a lot of U.S. companies offshoring a lot of production, you have these concentrations, for example, semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan and South Korea. There's a huge amount of memory, the world's memory capacity sitting next to the DMZ in North Korea, and there's a hell of a lot of the world's ASIC and fabbing power sitting in Taiwan, both for China, ironically, of course, and for the U.S. And so there's a perception that maybe that's not a good thing over the long run, that there should be more diversity there, and maybe some of that capacity can be brought back to the U.S. And most developed countries do subsidize advanced manufacturing to some degree, Germany and Israel and other places. And so I think the feeling is, gosh, everybody else is doing it. China's doing it. Why shouldn't the U.S. be a part of that and help to make sure that things like semiconductors are not all manufactured, or most of them manufactured outside of the U.S.
Yeah. Can this work? I mean, is this is it too late for a new generation advanced manufacturing renaissance in the U.S. that can address, not just that can bring 10,000 jobs back, but can really address the sort of security vulnerabilities that people are really worried about?
Well, I think the problem is that is really sort of a people problem. So you can see potentially building a facility in the U.S. like something as complicated as a high-end semiconductor manufacturing facility, but you need the people to man it. Foxconn has been trying to build this factory in Wisconsin, and they're trying to find a certain 13,000 qualified people, engineers.
And they gave up basically, right?
Basically, it's too difficult. So the part of the problem in the U.S. it's not just it's a part. And there was a good article actually that was written a couple of days ago about this very issue, which is that if you do offshore all this advanced manufacturing, a lot of stuff goes with it, right? Innovation, some of the supporting industries, and then obviously the U.S. education system is really not geared up to meet the demand. I mean, and again, that's where China, for example, has a huge advantage because they're cracking out really large numbers of well-qualified people. I was just in Shenzhen a couple of days ago. A good friend of mine runs an AI company, and he says, they go out here to the universities, they give a lecture, they give a really, really, really hard test to people there, and they interview them on the spot. They get the top 5 people, and then they hire them on the spot. And he said there's no way he could do that in the U.S. because there's just not the pool of ready people. And these are undergraduates too, including both undergraduates and graduates. So obviously, that's a piece. If the U.S. is going to attract back advanced manufacturing, I think it's going to have to be, probably the more traditionally government program to really boost the education system
and immigration too,
and not not cut off immigration, because the problem is really people. This is again where if you look at China, there's just this huge advantage. You can't wish that away. And then as you raised the concern about this other piece that is a huge obsession in the U.S. with supply chains and the fact that there's so many supply chains in China. So and there have been some movement of supply chains out of China, but again, it's not the simple thing to relocate a factory, because it's all the supporting elements, and in some cases, education is part of it. Companies move out of China, for example, to Indonesia and other places. They have to educate the workforce there because that's part of the equation. It's not just the physical plant or the location. So that's I think. But I think there's enough momentum gathering in the U.S. now in a lot of different places, and industry supports this kind of thing too. The semiconductor industry, for example, would be supportive of bringing some of this stuff back to the U.S. But it's going to have to make sense from a market point of view too. It can't be sort of brute industrial policy. It's going to have a market element. The head of TSMC said this. He said, "Well, it's too expensive right now in the U.S." Right? So there would have to be some subsidies, and there would have to be a sort of a long-term vision for where does the U.S. want to be in 10 years on semiconductors and on 5G or 6G. There's a lot of churn in that space because we're going to wake up in 2029 and it's still going to be a world where Huawei and ZTE dominate and a couple of European companies dominate the field. So there's a real fear of that, and so there's some. But the problem is the U.S. system, the government, it's a short term, 4-year time horizon, and so it's hard to. And some of these technology issues are 10-year problems, right? How do you solve them in 10 years? And that's where again China has the advantage of this sort of, being able to stick to something for 10 years and see it out.
Yeah, I mean it's. you spoke to immigration, and as a foreigner who is recently washed out of the Chinese tech ecosystem, it's very clear that this is the real big edge that the U.S. has, is we can take talent from all over the world, and a lot more people speak English than speak Chinese. And it is incredibly hard from a linguistic perspective, from a cultural perspective, for Chinese firms to integrate foreign talent. This is something that the U.S. is proved is world class in. And, getting on my hobby horse here for us to throw this away because Stephen Miller reads some sketchy blogs is something that makes me very sad waking up reading the news every morning.
Yeah. I think, and we talk about in our top, one of our top risks this year was called Innovation Winter. We have to, this is part of our annual exercise to come up with the top 10 risks. And I think that's part of that was the sort of interruption of these flows of capital. And I think the personnel one's probably the most important between, not just China, but also other places like India and the U.S. with the sort of tightening up of visas and particularly on STEM students. And that's a huge thing for U.S. companies. They've been benefiting from a large number of those qualified students staying in the U.S. and working for them. And so I think that's probably the most, sort of one of the worst aspects of the U.S. China conflict and the decoupling is that the U.S. becomes essentially hostile territory for Chinese students and researchers. We're already hearing about that, for example, in the AI realm. And in part because of this issue we discussed earlier on the NA list, those companies, a lot of those companies, for example, sent researchers to conferences that are really computer vision and now I've heard from industry people here that they're avoiding those events in the U.S. and
I had a grad student in Korea and other places. There was like a grad student friend of mine and who was an engineering PhD, and she just wanted to present a paper in Hawaii, and it took 4 months, and the conference passed. And she's going to go work on recommendation algorithms for 10-cent video. This is the least scandalous security thing in the world, but it is now reaching out and affecting much more than the sort of sketchy targeted stuff, which I think it has every right to, but at the same time seeing it spill over is really unfortunate.
Right, and that gets back to your great comment earlier, which is, on really these really tough issues like Xinjiang that we've been dealing with here. At one level, I think there's a loss of patience and something should be done on this really tough issue. And so we have things like visas being denied for Chinese officials. But the technology piece is tricky because if you don't do it carefully, you risk sort of painting a whole industry with a certain brush, right? So part of the problem now is, for example, is that those companies sort of have a scarlet letter on them, right? Yep. Because of this issue. And so then the question is, how do you again, as I mentioned, how do you get that off your back? If you're going to take a sort of a broad brush approach, that's going to be one thing. I think there are those arguing in the U.S. that in terms of, for example, controlling technology, the U.S. should take a more sort of a high wall, a smaller sort of
whatever the
broad brush, whatever that means. But protect the technology and take strong measures as needed, but try to be a little more surgical and nuanced, and not end up with a situation where all Chinese students are painted as potentially spies for the Chinese government. This is the situation we're on in the U.S. And there's been a lot of pushback on that sort of approach from Asian organizations in the U.S. But that's the world we're in right now, where the climate in Washington is very toxic on China, and so we get these sort of these statements that are ultimately, I think, going to be really damaging for the U.S. As much as for the U.S. as for China.
Do you see any future in which Xi is still in power and the dynamic changes?
No, I think with Xi in power, probably not. I think, but I think I was in China when Tiananmen Square happened, right? So I've seen the China go from very stable and nobody on the streets to thousands of people on the streets. I think we make the mistake that some commentators in the West make, is that they sort of linearly project
out,
forward. I think that if you went the longer time you spend here, you realize there's a lot going on here. There are a lot of forces at work that could change the system suddenly, and we saw this with the recent leak of the Xinjiang documents. Right? There's people in the system here who may not agree with the direction of certain policies. So I think the mistake is to sort of project linearly forward and then say, well, this is never going to change. I think we're going to see the technology. And I've seen this just in this recent trip. I mean, the technology also is an enabler, right? I mean, when I first came to China, there was, the fax machine ruled, right? And even then, the students were able to use the fax machines to communicate. But now, the system is awash in information. And yes, there are controls of that information, but wow, I mean, people, I think, I find, for example, are very adept at getting around some of the controls. And so what I find is that people really do have a lot of visibility on what's going on. And so, it's sort of this situation we talked about earlier where the government has allowed the spread of this very enabling technology. And it can do this up to a certain point, but, it also enables people to really to have a much different view of the system. And so I think one of the views in the West seems to be that, people in China are living in this censored world where they don't know what's going on around them. And I think that's sort of a limited view of how China and its information realm is evolving. It's evolving very fast, and that I think plays into the difficulty of in managing any issue that comes up. Hong Kong is another good example, and even Xinjiang here, where we've seen leaks to WikiLeaks here, right? I mean, a Chinese sort of WikiLeaks issue, which wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago.
Sure. So AI chips, what are they? What's the Chinese government thinking about them?
Great issue. So AI chips are basically come in two flavors. One is sort of edge chips. That's the thing that's the Kirin part of the Kirin processor on your phone or your Apple your iPhone, and that's doing things like facial recognition on your phone to unlock your phone, right? So there's a big, and most of the startups in the world now are focusing on AI on the edge because they'll be those kinds of chips will be used in autonomous vehicles to do a lot of the processing at the front end of that, because again, a lot of image recognition and sort of computer vision, if you will. So that's the big thing. And then there's the chips that are in the cloud that are used for training. So that's the big iron. That's really dominated now by companies like NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel.
Sure.
U.S. companies. So China has come into this sort of, again, late in the game. You look at the National AI Plan, it emphasized the semiconductor part of the equation, and everybody gets that now, that the AI stack with semiconductors at the base, training algorithms in the middle, and then sort of the applications on top, that China maybe has a chance to play more at the lower end of the stack here. But it's really tough because the established players are so big. So I think, again, ironically in this, the best semiconductor AI company in China is Huawei. They have actually
HiSilicon, baby.
HiSilicon is
investing 10% in R&D for 30 years gets you somewhere.
HiSilicon is going to be the biggest customer of TSMC next year, and I think that's very telling. And that's by far and large is cutting edge chips, not just AI chips, but certainly they're looking at pushing into that market. The really interesting thing is if HiSilicon and Huawei would become OEMs for those chips to other Chinese companies, because right now all of their chips that they're designing are for their own consumption. And I think this is where the U.S. China tech Cold War that we've talked about comes in, where if the U.S.
Explain that concept.
Okay.
OEMs for other Chinese companies. What would that mean?
That would mean that for example, that Huawei could sell its chips to Xiaomi or to Oppo or Vivo or some of or ZTE to use in their handsets or for example, their base stations. So right now, those companies are buying from Qualcomm, they're buying from Broadcom, they're buying from a whole host of other vendors. Huawei and HiSilicon have taken the route of designing essentially all the chips that they are going to use, all the major chips they're going to use, except for memory. So they're going to. So the Huawei phone I just bought has the Beilong 5000, which is the sort of Qualcomm equivalent. It's the baseband chip that's doing a lot of the RF processing, and then the Kirin system on a chip has both Huawei IP in there and ARM IP, which is one of their partners. And so those, and then they're also designing the AI chips for the edge, the Ascend 301. The Ascend 901 was going to be a cloud-based version. That's also based on ARM, and so they basically have made the decision to develop almost all their own chips except for the memory piece of it, which is really difficult. And they're going to still rely on the major players like South Korea and even the U.S. Micron is a big vendor to them. But if they decide to not just use those chips for their own handsets and their own base stations and sell those to other Chinese companies, that would be a huge boost for the Chinese industry in terms of weaning itself off of U.S. and other foreign technology.
So what goes into that decision? Just like being good enough and being able to produce it cheap enough that the profit margins are such that even if we sell it to our competitors, it still works out for us? Yeah.
I mean, I think there would have to be a strong business case. I mean, when I talk to people at Huawei, for example, they say it's not really in their DNA, right? I mean, they don't see themselves.
Yeah, they want to kill these guys.
Right. They don't see themselves as sort of the savior of China's, semiconductor industry, or to, making indigenous innovation, a part of their the DNA. So it would have to be the business case would have to be there to do this. And you can see the government potentially weighing in and saying, gee, maybe it would be great if you supplied these chips to other companies, because the problem is the HiSilicon is so good, right? And they're manufacturing these things. They have TSMC. They can manufacture at the 7 nanometer and beyond node, and so they're really the only company in China that's really capable of iterating these designs at that cutting edge. And so they sort of, it might be a natural move for them to move into that business, but they don't, they're sort of, I think it will depend on the U.S. China, the state of the trade talks and where we end up in the next year or so with this whole decoupling thing. And,
because the dynamic being that Xiaomi is worried that if they start buying Huawei chips, then they're going to be sucked into whatever mess Huawei is in.
Right. I think we have to sort of, the dust has to settle on the U.S. action against Huawei, and
which may never. Right.
Well, this week there'll probably be some licenses, that are going to be issued. Probably maybe by the time we're on the air, they'll have issued some licenses. But yeah, I think the general feeling is that this will muddle through going forward. But again, Huawei has made a decision to no matter what happens, to continue to pursue development of it and wean itself off of basically all of the really key semiconductors that it has relied on, except for some niche areas like memory. So I think that in the next year we'll see where China's going to go on both its own internal efforts to put pressure on companies to reduce their dependence on foreign technology, and also on the capabilities to develop the capabilities to do this. This is a long-term game. This isn't going to go away soon, because semiconductors really are rocket science, and it takes a lot of effort. And again, the right personnel you mentioned that they've invested in R&D, that's taken a long time. But yeah, this is China's playing the long game here. I think for a lot of our clients are concerned, of course, that what this means over the next 10 years is that basically China designs out U.S. technology, right? And so that's sort of the where the real impact on the U.S. And that's that they make a national security argument here, which is that they're generating a tremendous amount of R&D revenue. Amount of revenue in China, which they're applying back into R&D, and then they're able to innovate for the U.S. market, which helps U.S. national security, right? So
say that one more time. Who's making that argument?
This is the argument that the U.S. semiconductor industry is making.
The NVIDIAs of the world,
right? Because the U.S. semiconductor industry derives 36% of its global revenue from China, right? Yeah, and a big chunk of that is from Huawei. So if you're going to basically over time erode that revenue, then that's
all of a sudden our company's 30% smaller. We're hiring 30% fewer PhDs. Right. The whole thing atrophies.
Right. Yeah, and then their ability to innovate and iterate and keep ahead of the curve is slowly eroded. That's the argument.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, maybe. Yeah, that's a hard one to game out.
I mean, because the question is, are there alternative markets that they, can
spend more work on? And
I mean, I think that the general view is that China is such a huge market, and those companies are not just selling into it, but they're designing for it, right? Because in some cases, China is leading in developing certain kinds of applications, and so it's sort of a twofer there. It's not just the revenue, but it's the sort of the size of the market and the fact that it can scale. So rapidly and hugely.
Yeah. A little bit more on Huawei. You've been following this company for a very long time now, and it is really one of the very few firms, if not the only firm in China, that is absolutely world beating in like the hardest thing in like one of the hardest things to research in the world. So Can you reflect a little bit about what it was that got it to where it is today and why so many other Chinese firms have not necessarily been able to be there? Or is that the wrong framing when we're taking a look at a developing country, and the fact that they have at least one company doing this sort of thing is an accomplishment in and of itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of debate around the rise. How did Huawei become such a dominant player? I think there's a couple factors. Clearly, they had some very capable management team there. I mean, you can't sort of escape that. And interestingly, they had that management team at a time when probably very few other Chinese companies did, and a team that was intent on making the company global, right? I mean, they obviously, I think from the very beginning, didn't see themselves as just a Chinese company.
Yeah, they brought in Intel to be their big consultants and teach them how to manage. And
not just Intel, they brought in McKinsey and IBM, and they brought a lot of consultants in to sort of teach them how to become a global player. Yeah. So I think that, and then they were also, we mustn't underestimate just the size of the Chinese market. So when the Chinese government basically decided to sort of wean itself off foreign telecom companies for a lot of the infrastructure in the 90s, by that time Huawei and ZTE were just becoming mature, and so they had sort of a ready-made huge market, right? Which is something that you can't sort of dismiss. I think the key thing was this commitment to plowing a lot of money back into R&D, and that
just comes from Ren Zhengfei's personal commitment,
right, and also service. So the thing that you find, people talk about, they're undercutting on price, but really what a lot of carriers really like, and we hear this all the time, is if Deutsche Telekom has a problem with a network, they'll put 50 engineers on a plane and send it out there. So they have this very sort of strong commitment to service, and that's
interesting. Yeah,
and that's something
rare for a Chinese firm.
That's right, and I think it was probably at the time, even domestically, they set up offices all around China, and it was very rare for Chinese companies to have this sort of approach. So I think their success can be attributed to sort of whatever you want to say. Run seems to have been a bit of a visionary, and his sort of personal will in bringing in a very very senior managers and maintaining sort of a focus on the core technology and on service. So 25 years later, they're a juggernaut, and they're a global player. So yeah, I mean, I think, but it is a good question as to why other Chinese companies haven't been able to do this. You go to ZTE, and they're a very capable company, but they seem like a state-owned enterprise, right?
Yeah.
They still have the feel of sort of the state-owned enterprise origins, whereas Huawei feels like a genuine, like a multinational company, and operates globally in that manner. So they feel very international from the get-go.
Very Chinese, but Chinese looking out.
Right. I mean, that's one of the criticisms is that there aren't that many senior foreigners in management. But yeah, I mean, they're a very Chinese company with global footprint and aspirations, and have been able to execute in a way that is unusual. I mean, I mentioned Haier earlier. There are some of the examples. I think that's the challenge, the real challenge going forward of companies that are in these other areas that are a little more competitive now. They're more sensitive because of data issues. For example, Alibaba and Tencent going into Europe, where there's new data privacy regulations. So Chinese companies now, Huawei, I think, faced a less difficult regulatory environment probably 20 years ago than the new sort of Chinese tech wave. Now China is never going to be deemed adequate under GDPR. Nobody believes that. But the companies are trying to themselves be compliant. And we don't really know how that's going to play out in when the regulators sort of turn their attention to China and Europe, because this hasn't really happened before. I was talking to this drone company I mentioned earlier, XAG, which is trying to do similar things in Europe that they're doing in China. But they're setting up drones.
People,
right? They're setting up drones and taking pictures of farms. They're getting into some potentially sensitive areas, and they're also very conscious of the regulatory environment in Europe and trying to figure out how to navigate that. So that's we're in this interesting time when data has now become sort of
ridiculous.
The big issue.
What's sensitive about the vineyards in southern France? I mean, come on. What secrets are you really going to learn? Are you make big bets on the commodities markets or this stuff? I mean, look at some satellites.
Well, the example in the U.S. is of DJI, right, which ran into trouble when they were surveying, critical infrastructure like electric pylons that for maintenance, and they were sending data back somewhere, the Ali Cloud, and so they've worked pretty hard in the U.S. to try to ensure regulators that they're not sending everything back to Beijing. But but I think drones inherently drones up there doing something, and particularly you throw AI into it too. Then that raises a lot of hackles in certain quarters. So but I think that the data issue is really going forward. I think, and even Huawei is facing this too. Like, how do they handle data? And are they GDPR compliant? What sort of data they have their hands on? There's a perception, for example, that Huawei has its hands on data, but as a vendor, they don't really have they have a very limited exposure to the actual data flowing over the network. They have a sort of low level maintenance view of this. They're still under scrutiny as to, in terms of how they deal with data in vendor networks or in carrier networks. So the data issue, I think, going forward is going to be huge because China is still an outlier, right? I mean, they're not in any of the major data regimes like GDPR,
and they won't ever be. I mean,
well, interestingly, during the trade talks, the issue of opening up cloud services in China came up, and that inevitably led to discussions about things like the cross-border privacy rules in APEC, which have been out there for a while. They're voluntary. Some in China don't like them, but there's sort of an Asian effort to get a handle around data and data localization. There's also CPP, which is really the gold standard for some of the data, outlawing data localization. And so eventually, at some point, you can see if the trade talks go well and we get back to discussing some of these really tough issues around data, that at least it'll be out there on the table, because there are those in China who recognize they can't forever remain outside global best practices on data, or their companies are going to have a really hard time operating outside of China. So that's something we look at a lot for clients.
Sure. So last question, and I asked it before, but I'm going to ask it again. So folks wanting to learn more about these issues, if they don't necessarily have the wherewithal to book tickets to Barcelona and hang out with Qualcomm engineers, advice particularly for young folks looking to learn more about these sorts of issues.
I mean, there's a lot of really good resources out there on the web, for example. So I recommend sites like Light Reading. Some of the industry sites, like Digital Times, is a really good on the semiconductor industry, and they're written for an audience that's not necessarily steeped in the physics of semiconductors, but they're really good industry sites like that track things, so that over time you get a good sense of what the issues are in the industry, and they touch on a lot of policy issues too. They're focused on technology. So Digital Times for semiconductors. Light Reading is really good for the telecom industry. They cover 5G, and then the GSMA also that runs Barcelona, for example. They put out a lot of studies that are free out there on sort of the 5G industry, and so I think there's the nice thing is there's lots of resources out there to avail yourself of, and certainly conferences. I mean, really for 5G, I think Barcelona, it's a beautiful place, and the hotels are really good. But there are other conferences, there are versions of that are held in LA and in I think there's one in Korea. So those kind of technology conferences, and I know those are certainly venues where you can talk to people in the industry and get a really good sense of the things going. I attend 4 to 5 sort of industry conferences a year. I try to at least, in addition to talking to regularly to our clients who are working on these issues. So there's ways to do that, but it's tricky because in college and in sort of curriculums, there's not a lot of emphasis on technology policy. There's some newer programs that are focusing on that. So it's a combination of both the technology, understanding technology, and the policy piece of it. And I think that's where, when I'm looking to hire people, I look for people who ideally have some industry experience, maybe a little bit of government experience, so they understand sort of how policy is made, and then understand something about a regional, like China or regional markets, because all those things are critical to understanding, where things are going with 5G in U.S., China, or the EU.
Yeah. But I think, as this past hour of conversation clearly indicates, none of these issues are going away. And they're a reflection of broader geopolitical trends, which are towards, more tension across every dimension. And we're not going to go back to 1996 anytime soon. And given that, these sorts of, very fundamental differences that countries have will filter down into things that seem apolitical on their face, but actually have a lot of very naughty stuff tied into them.
Yeah, I think we're in this meme now where, for any advanced technology, AI, quantum computing, 5G, semiconductors, there is more and more a sense that that we're locked in sort of this competition to dominate these or to become to be major players in this. And it's not just U.S. and China; it's Europe too. Europe feels like they don't have any big players, for example, in AI, and because they don't have any big platform companies like Google or Alibaba. And so the rest of the world is looking at sort of the U.S. China piece, and they're wondering how do they fit into this? Because it is not just about the U.S. and China, but it's about the next 1.5 billion internet users in emerging markets. Of course, a lot of them are going to be using Transsion phones, and they're going to be using Alipay and WeChat Pay to pay for things, right? So there's
Facebook Pay,
or Facebook, right? Or Libra. Maybe Libra will that's the argument that's the
real
Facebook,
market for it, right? It is like Africa and
it's the
Venezuela.
Unbanked. It's the unbanked in the developed world. So ironically, of course, that's the argument.
The freaking Congress is just screwing over Facebook's Africa and Middle East plans,
right? And the Facebook pushback is that if you do that, the Chinese companies are going to dominate, those segments. And so, unfortunately, even though we're talking about we talk about other markets like developing countries in Africa, there is sort of a China-U.S. dimension to that because the big players, and the big platforms, and the payment systems are all from one or the other countries. But I think that's where that's exciting. That's the exciting thing is that think about 1.5 billion people unbanked online, and participating in the global dialogue here. Hopefully, it will bring opportunity, and we're going to be focusing, for example, at Eurasia Group next year on trying to do more on emerging markets, Africa, India, where there's a tremendous amount of development going on in the tech realm, and they're also grappling with all these issues we've discussed around data and around who's building their 5G networks. So that's what makes the job interesting here, is that we have clients that are dealing with all these globally, and so it's not just the U.S. and China ends up being the last 2 years a big chunk of our work, but we almost every issue, even with U.S. and China, has a global dimension to it, and so that's what makes the work exciting.
Paul, thanks for being a part of China Econ Talk.
Great. Thanks.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices podcast, and of course, the Sinica podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.